The set was silent. 70 people. Not one of them moving. Cameras idle. Equipment untouched. Coffee going cold in paper cups. And standing at the edge of it all, in the California morning light, was Will Smith. Unannounced. Uninvited. Alone. Nobody had called ahead. Nobody had cleared it with production. There was no publicist standing beside him, no assistant managing the moment, no carefully worded statement prepared for what came next. He had simply shown up. At the gate of one of the most disciplined film sets in Hollywood history, and asked to be let in. Word reached the set in under 2 minutes. And when it did, every person on that crew turned toward one chair. The director's chair, where Clint Eastwood sat with a coffee of his own, a shot list across his knee, and the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of knowing exactly who you are and what your set demands. Clint didn't stand up immediately. He didn't raise his voice. He asked one question in the same quiet tone he used for everything, whether he was adjusting a camera angle or ending someone's career on the spot. He asked it to his first assistant director without looking up from the shot list. Did he call ahead? The answer was no. Clint set down his coffee. And he stood up. What happened next would be talked about in Hollywood long after that morning was over. Not because it was loud. Not because it was dramatic. But because it was the opposite of everything anyone expected from a man like Clint Eastwood when someone broke the first and most important rule of his set. And if you want to understand what Clint did and why it shocked an entire industry, you have to understand the two men standing on either side of that moment. Because they could not have been more different. And they could not have needed each other more. If stories like this one stay with you, subscribe now so you never miss another one. Clint Eastwood had been running film sets since 1971. In all that time, one thing never changed. His sets started on time. They finished on time. Sometimes ahead of schedule. The crew was treated with the kind of respect that most actors reserved only for studio executives. Grips, gaffers, sound operators, production assistants. Clint knew their names. He knew how early they had to wake up to be ready when he arrived. And he never, not once in 5 decades of directing, made them wait for him. His philosophy was simple and it never wavered. The work was the point. Not the attention around the work. Not the reputation the work built. Not the awards that came after. The work itself, done well, done honestly, done on time, with full respect for every person who showed up to make it happen. That was the standard. And on a Clint Eastwood set, it was not a suggestion. He had earned that standard the hard way. Universal Studios had dropped him early in his career, telling him his teeth were too big and his voice too quiet for leading roles. Sergio Leone had worked him through 3 films in the Spanish desert without once calling him by his name, in brutal heat, wearing a costume that was never washed, treating him less like a leading man and more like a piece of equipment that happened to speak English. Clint had said nothing. He had shown up. Every day. On time. And he had done the work. By the time Will Smith appeared at that gate, Clint was in his 90s and still directing. Still arriving before the crew. Still finishing ahead of schedule. Still carrying the same belief he had carried since those early years of being dismissed and underestimated. That the only thing a person truly controls is whether they show up and whether they do the work with everything they have. Will Smith had built a different kind of career. Not lesser. Just different, built on entirely different foundations. For 30 years he had been one of the most beloved figures in the entertainment world. Audiences didn't just admire Will Smith. They felt warmth toward him. A personal warmth, the kind usually reserved for people you actually know. He had engineered that connection deliberately and brilliantly. He had studied the patterns of the biggest stars in history, identified what drove audiences into theaters, and reverse-engineered his own path to the top with the precision of someone who had something to prove. And it had worked. Completely. Until the night it didn't. The Oscar slap had not just damaged Will Smith's reputation. It had collapsed the entire architecture of who he had built himself to be. The man who made everyone feel good had, in 11 seconds and in front of 15 million people, become something he had spent his whole life performing against. And no amount of charm, no carefully crafted public statement, no return project could rebuild what that moment had taken apart. Because what it had taken apart wasn't his image. It was the story he told himself about who he was. By the time he stood at that gate, Will Smith wasn't looking for a photo opportunity or a redemption narrative to share with a journalist. He was looking for something harder to find and harder to name. He needed to be somewhere that fame meant nothing. Somewhere the performance stopped mattering. Somewhere the only currency was whether you showed up and did the work. Nobody walked onto a Clint Eastwood set without an invitation. Nobody. He had come alone. No car waiting at the curb. No assistant holding a phone. No security detail standing 2 steps behind him. Just Will Smith, in plain clothes, standing at the gate of a working film set in the California morning, asking the gate guard if he could come in. The guard recognized him immediately. Everyone recognized Will Smith. That had been true for 30 years, and it was still true now, even after everything. But recognition meant nothing at this gate. The list was the list. Your name was on it or it wasn't. And Will Smith's name was not on it. The guard was professional and respectful. He explained that the set was closed. That access required prior clearance from production. That he was sorry, but he couldn't let him through without authorization. Will nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for a phone to call someone who could fix it. He simply asked if someone could let the director know he was there. Then he stepped back from the gate and he waited. Word moved fast on a Clint Eastwood set. It always did, because the crew was lean and focused and information traveled the way it does in any tight professional operation, quickly and without drama. The first AD received the message, processed it for exactly 1 second, and walked directly to Clint's chair. He leaned down and spoke quietly. Clint listened without changing his expression. Then came the question. Delivered without urgency. Without irritation. Just 4 words spoken in that low, unhurried voice that the crew had learned to pay close attention to precisely because it never rose. Did he call ahead? The AD said no. Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't let him leave." That instruction moved through the crew like a current. Don't let him leave. Not send him away. Not tell him to call the office and schedule something properly. Don't let him leave. People exchanged glances, but nobody said a word. A production assistant was dispatched to the gate with a message. Will Smith was to be escorted to the edge of the set. Not inside. Not to a chair in the shade. To the edge. Where the equipment ended and the open ground began. And he was to wait there. He waited in the sun. There was no shade where he was standing. No chair was brought out for him. The crew moved around him the way water moves around a stone, acknowledging his presence without stopping for it. Cameras were adjusted. Lighting was checked. Marks were set. The machinery of a professional film set continued exactly as it would have if he weren't there at all. For a man who had spent 30 years walking into rooms that stopped when he entered, rooms that reorganized themselves around his presence, rooms that offered him every comfort before he thought to ask for it, this was something entirely new. He was invisible here. Not cruelly. Not deliberately. The crew wasn't ignoring him out of coldness. They were simply doing their jobs. And their jobs did not include him. He stood there and he felt it. The full weight of what it meant to be in a place where who you were outside the gate had no value inside it. And somewhere underneath the discomfort, something else was present. Something quieter. Something that felt, strangely, like relief. Then Clint Eastwood stood up from his director's chair and began walking toward him. The crew noticed. They always noticed when Clint moved with intention across his own set. It happened rarely, and the last time most of them could remember it happening, an actor had left the production by the end of the morning. Clint Eastwood crossed the set himself. The crew had seen this once before. It never ended well. Clint covered the distance without hurrying. That was the thing people always remembered about him afterward, that he never hurried. Not when he was angry. Not when he was delivering news that would change someone's life. The slower he moved, the more serious it was. And he moved slowly now. He stopped in front of Will Smith. They stood at roughly the same height, two men who had both spent decades being the largest presence in any room they entered. Except that here, on this ground, only one of them had earned that. The crew had gone quiet. Not stopped working entirely, but quieter. The kind of quiet where people find reasons to be near enough to hear without appearing to listen. Clint looked at him for a moment. Then he spoke. "You're on my set without being invited." "Why?" There was no anger in the question. No performance of authority. Just a plain question requiring a plain answer. And Will Smith, who had spent 30 years having the right answer ready, who had built an entire career on knowing exactly what a room needed to hear and delivering it with perfect timing, did something that surprised even himself. He told the truth. He said he didn't come for a meeting. He didn't come to talk about a project or ask for advice or be seen in the right company at the right moment. He said he came because he needed to understand something. Something he couldn't find in any conversation he'd had in the past 2 years. What it looked like to work without needing the room to love you. What it felt like to show up and do the work when the work was the only thing that mattered. He said he thought if he could just watch that, just see it happening in front of him, something might become clear that had been dark for a long time. He stopped talking. The morning was quiet around them. Somewhere behind Clint, a camera operator made a small adjustment and then went still again. Clint said nothing for a long moment. He just looked at Will with the same expression he brought to everything, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away. Then he asked one question. Quiet as everything else he said. "Can you do that?" Work when nobody's applauding. Will had no prepared answer. He opened his mouth and closed it again. And the silence that followed was the most honest thing he had communicated in longer than he could remember. Clint held his gaze. Then he said what he saw. Not cruelly. Not as a lecture. The way a man speaks when he has earned the right to say a hard thing simply. He told Will that he could see a man who had built everything on being liked. Who had learned early that warmth opened doors and charm solved problems, and if enough people loved you, you never had to sit alone with yourself and find out who was actually there. He said he recognized that man. Not because he was the same, but because he had spent years working around versions of him. And he had watched, more times than he could count, what happened when the thing those men depended on was taken away. Will didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a deflection or a self-deprecating joke to soften the moment. He just stood there and received it. And that, more than anything he could have said, was the thing that changed what happened next. Because Clint Eastwood looked at him for another long moment and then he did something nobody on that crew expected. He didn't send him away. He turned slightly and gestured toward the working set behind him. "Then watch," he said. "Don't talk. Don't perform. Just watch." A chair was brought. Not a prominent one. A simple folding chair set at the far edge of the set where Will could see without being seen. And Will Smith sat down in it, and for the rest of the day he did exactly what he had been told. He watched. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't signal to anyone that he was there. For the first time in 30 years, nobody on a working set was looking at him. And he let that be true. He watched Clint move through the day's work the way someone watches a craftsman who has been at his trade for so long that the craft and the man have become the same thing. Quiet instruction. Precise adjustment. No wasted motion. No performance of authority. Just the work, done with full attention, full respect for everyone participating in it, and not one moment spent seeking acknowledgement for any of it. Something shifted in Will Smith that afternoon. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It didn't announce itself. It was more like a door that had been stuck for years finally moving on its hinges. Just a fraction. Just enough to let something in that had been waiting outside for a long time. The shoot wrapped at 6:17 in the evening. Clint called it cleanly, the way he always did, no fanfare, no extended goodbyes, just a quiet word to the first AD and the day was done. The crew moved efficiently into the end-of-day routine. Equipment covered. Cables coiled. Positions logged for the morning. Will Smith was still sitting in the folding chair at the edge of the set. He hadn't moved from it in hours. He hadn't asked for water or food or a different chair or anything at all. He had simply stayed where he had been put and done what he had been told. And now, with the crew dispersing around him and the light going gold and long across the California ground, he sat quietly and waited for nothing in particular. Clint noticed. He noticed everything on his set. That was what 30 years of directing had built in him, not authority, not reputation, but attention. A permanent, practiced attention to what was actually happening in front of him rather than what he expected or preferred to see. He picked up 2 cups of coffee from the craft table. He walked to where Will was sitting. He lowered himself into a second folding chair that a passing grip had set down nearby without being asked. And he sat beside him. Not across from him. Beside him. The way you sit with someone when you aren't there to judge them. They watched the last of the crew finish up for a while without speaking. Then Clint began to talk. Not the way people expected Clint Eastwood to talk. Not with the weight of legend behind every word. Just a man, at the end of a working day, saying something true to someone who looked like they needed to hear it. He talked about the day Universal Studios told him he didn't have the right look for leading roles. He talked about 3 films in the Spanish desert under a director who refused to call him by his name, who handed him a costume and told him to wear it unwashed through an entire production because the actor's comfort was not a factor worth considering. He talked about the years when the work was the only thing he had, because the validation wasn't coming and the recognition wasn't coming and the only question left was whether he was going to keep showing up anyway. He said he wasn't telling all this to compare their situations. He was telling him because there was something he had learned in those years that had never left him. The work didn't care how famous you were. It didn't care how many people loved you or how many had turned away. The work only responded to one thing. Whether you came to it fully, whether you brought everything you had and left the performance of yourself outside the door. The work was the only honest mirror he had ever found. And it had never once told him anything but the truth. Will listened the way he had watched the set all day. Without constructing a response. Without managing how he appeared. He just listened. Then he asked the question he had probably been carrying for 2 years without knowing how to put it into words. He asked it quietly, looking at the ground in front of him rather than at Clint. How do you stop needing them to like you? Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he said 7 words. You decide the work is enough. Then you work. That was all. No elaboration. No philosophical framework built around it. Just the answer, plain and final, the way Clint delivered everything that actually mattered. Will nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a while. And Clint didn't fill the silence. He just drank his coffee and let the answer sit there between them in the evening air where it could do what it needed to do. In the days that followed, the story moved through Hollywood the way real stories do, quietly, without a press release, passed from one crew member to another in the way that true things travel. Nobody had filmed it. Nobody had posted it. There was no statement from either man's representation and no carefully managed narrative attached to it. Just the account of what had happened from the people who had been there, spreading person to person through an industry that had seen every kind of performance and could recognize, when it appeared, the thing that was not one. And what struck people most, the detail that came up every time someone described that day, was not that Will Smith had shown up uninvited. It was that for an entire afternoon on a working film set, nobody had looked at him. And he had stayed anyway. Clint Eastwood had been told early and often that he didn't have what it took. The voice was wrong. The look was wrong. The teeth, the Adam's apple, the quiet. All of it wrong, according to people who considered themselves qualified to judge. He had listened to every assessment and then continued working. Decade after decade. Film after film. Ahead of schedule. Under budget. Without requiring the industry to love him in order to function. At 90 years old, he was still directing. Still arriving before the crew. Still finishing what he started. The standard he had set on his very first production had not shifted a single degree across half a century of work. And the films that had come from that standard, Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, Gran Torino, were not just successful. They were permanent. The kind of work that outlasts the noise surrounding it and remains when everything else has faded. Will Smith's return to the work was quieter than anything he had done before. Not diminished. Quieter. There was something different in the way he carried himself in interviews in the period that followed, something that the people who had known him for years noticed without always being able to name. The performance of ease had softened. What was underneath it was more present. Less managed. More real. A crew member who had been on set that day described it simply when asked about it later. She said it wasn't like watching a celebrity get a lesson. It was like watching someone be handed a mirror and actually look into it. She said most people, when handed that mirror, find a reason to look away. Will Smith had looked. Clint's legacy was not built on a single moment or a famous confrontation or a speech that spread through the press. It was built the same way every day for 50 years. By showing up. By protecting the time of the people who showed up with him. By treating the work as something that deserved full presence and nothing less. The poncho from those early Leone films hangs in a museum now. One of the most recognized costumes in the history of cinema. Leone's camera angles are studied in film schools. But what audiences remember, what they have always remembered, is the man in the poncho. The stillness. The quiet. The thing Clint brought to every frame that no director's vision could manufacture, because it came from somewhere inside him that the work had built over years of showing up when nobody was watching and doing it right anyway. Some things survive the noise. Some things don't. The ones that do are almost always built the same way. Quietly. Consistently. Without waiting for the room to applaud before continuing. There is a kind of talent that fills every room it enters. That reads the temperature instantly, adjusts, performs, connects, and leaves everyone warmer than they were before. The world rewards that talent generously. It opens doors and builds careers and earns love from strangers in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. And there is nothing wrong with it. It is a real gift. But it comes with a cost that doesn't show up on the invoice until much later. Because the day that talent stops working, the day the room doesn't respond the way it always has, the day the applause goes quiet, everything built on top of it becomes suddenly uncertain. And the question that was always underneath it, the one that the performance was partly designed to drown out, gets louder. Who are you when nobody is looking? Clint Eastwood spent 50 years answering that question the same way. With work. Honest, disciplined, unglamorous work done at the same standard whether anyone was watching or not. That was his answer. And it built something that is still standing. Will Smith sat in a folding chair on the edge of a working film set and watched a man who had never needed the room to love him. And somewhere in that afternoon, In the quiet of simply being present without performing, he found the beginning of a different kind of answer. The work is enough. Then you work. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever walked into a room and realized the only thing standing between you and who you could be was your need to be liked? Tell us in the comments.